When President Trump looked her dead in the eye and said, "You don't belong in this room," no one expected her to stay calm. But what Jasmine Crockett said next stunned everyone into silence. It happened just after 3:20 p.m. in the Roosevelt Room. Cameras were rolling, everyone was seated, Democrats to the left, Republicans to the right, and President Trump at the head of the polished oval table. A few aides stood quietly near the walls. The meeting was tense from the start: public school funding, teacher shortages, standardized testing. Nobody was in the mood to sugarcoat. But when Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett leaned slightly forward to question the logic behind cutting early learning grants, the air shifted. Trump turned toward her slowly, not angry, not yelling, just deliberate. "You don't belong in this room," he said. A beat of silence followed, a flicker of disbelief across the faces in the room. Even the senior staffer who had been scribbling notes froze mid-word. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't blink. But the weight of what had just been said sat heavy on everyone's shoulders. Senator Richard Kellman, seated 3 chairs down, cleared his throat but said nothing. The Secretary of Education's assistant glanced up, visibly uncomfortable. 2 of the White House interns near the doorway exchanged wide-eyed looks but didn't dare speak. No one knew what to say. Yet everyone knew what had just happened, not because of the volume, Trump hadn't raised his voice, but because of the sharp, public dismissal of a sitting congresswoman, a black woman, young, brilliant, unflinching, right in front of colleagues, cameras, and constituents. And it wasn't just the words. It was how easily they came out. The live stream caught everything. Phones lit up in pockets across the country. Some people gasped. Some didn't believe it was real. But millions watched it as it happened. Jasmine's fingers rested lightly against the table. Her gaze stayed locked. She could have fired back. She could have raised her voice or stormed out. But she did something no one expected. She waited 3 seconds, then 6, long enough to make it clear she was choosing her moment. "I was elected by the people," she said, steady and measured, "just like you. I belong here because my district sent me here, and I'll stay in this room until every child in this country, no matter their zip code, has the right to learn without being forgotten." The words hung in the air. Trump leaned back in his chair, his lips pressed into a thin line, then glanced to his right, muttering something to an aide. No response. The room was still quiet, but now it was a different kind of quiet. Senator Kellman shifted, this time with something like respect in his posture. One of the younger congresswomen nodded slowly. Someone coughed near the back, and still, Jasmine didn't look away. The moderator from the Department of Education tried to move on, awkwardly suggesting they return to discussing budget allocations, but the meeting was already changed. So was the tone. So was the story. Outside the building, reporters were glued to screens. News anchors were scrambling for transcripts. Political analysts were texting producers to get them on air. Social media exploded with a single phrase. She said it calmly, not aggressively, not performatively, just clearly. Because of that, it cut deeper. The clip would be edited a dozen ways before the sun set. Some networks would amplify it, others would downplay it, but the truth had already landed. And in the minds of millions watching, parents, teachers, students, community leaders, it wasn't just a political moment. It was personal. But Jasmine knew the moment wasn't just about what had been said. It was about everything that had brought her to that table in the first place. Jasmine Crockett wasn't supposed to be in politics, at least not at first. She had a different kind of fire. Raised in Shreveport, Louisiana, in a 2-bedroom house that sat across from a junkyard and behind a corner store that doubled as a laundromat, she spent most of her childhood watching her mother clean houses while holding down part-time shifts at the city library. Her father hadn't been around much. He'd pop in with promises and disappear with excuses. It was her older brother, Jaden, who kept her grounded. He used to walk her home from school, always 3 steps behind, always scanning the street like it was his job. He got into trouble early, small stuff at first, then more serious. Jasmine remembered sitting in the back of that courtroom at age 14, knees bouncing while a public defender fumbled his way through her brother's case. That was the moment. She didn't cry that day, but her fists balled so tight her fingernails left half-moons in her palms. Afterward, while her mom tried to hold it together in the parking lot, Jasmine whispered, "He deserved better." By 16, she was volunteering at a legal clinic in Dallas during the summers. By 19, she'd won her first statewide debate title at Prairie View A&M. Law school was never a question. It was survival. What drove her wasn't ambition. It was witnessing how little protection people had when no one knew their name. In her first year out of law school, she took public defense cases that paid next to nothing. She'd drive 3 hours just to represent someone being denied bail over a broken taillight ticket. Then Ferguson happened, then Tamir, then Sandra. She kept a notepad on her nightstand because she couldn't sleep. Her brain wouldn't stop. One night, after reading about a teacher strike in Missouri, she scribbled 3 words, "Fight from inside." She ran for state office in Texas in her early 30s against an incumbent who laughed, literally laughed, when she announced her campaign. He called her a temporary flare in a long game. She beat him by 4 points. Her congressional run came later in a redrawn district where the lines had been skewed to bury votes like hers. She walked door to door in August heat that melted makeup off her face before noon. People didn't just see her, they listened because she didn't come talking in sound bites. She spoke like someone who knew the inside of a bail hearing and the pain of watching your brother handcuffed while your mother prayed on a courthouse bench. In every town hall she held, she repeated one sentence, "If I ever forget who sent me, send me home." So when she took her seat in that Roosevelt room, it wasn't a seat she pulled out for herself. It had been carved out by people who never got invited to that table in the first place. She wasn't there to charm or play nice. She was there to make sure their voices were heard. But that room wasn't built for people like her to speak freely. Not yet. She'd been ignored before, cut off mid-sentence, called emotional, aggressive, even out of line for asking direct questions. She learned early to choose her battles, to strike only when the words mattered more than the noise. That day with Trump, it wasn't her first time facing a man who tried to shrink the space around her, but it might have been the most public. In her district back in Texas, at that very moment, a group of third graders were watching the live stream with their civics teacher. They didn't understand all the policies being discussed, but they caught what was said and how she responded. One little girl, Kamari, leaned over to her friend and whispered, "She didn't even get mad. She just told him." Their teacher paused the video and said, "That's called presence." And Kamari wrote, Jasmine Crockett, at the top of her journal that afternoon next to the word, possible. But before any of that happened, Jasmine had to walk into a room where the walls weren't designed to echo voices like hers and still decide to speak. The Roosevelt room always looked smaller in person. Jasmine had seen it a dozen times on TV, always staged, always polished, always full of men in dark suits talking over each other. But in real life, it had a different kind of weight. The walls felt close, not because of the size, but because of the history trapped inside them. On that Thursday afternoon, the long conference table was lined with name placards, government folders, and sweating glasses of ice water that no one touched. The meeting was about education reform, or at least that was the headline. In reality, it was a tug-of-war over numbers, narratives, and who got to define success. Seated near Jasmine was Representative Cole Landry from Arkansas, mid-50s, who wore flag pins like armor. Across from him sat Congresswoman Jasmine, whose district in California had been fighting to keep 3 elementary schools from shutting down. Every time she spoke, the Secretary of Education scribbled something without looking up. Jasmine sat 2 seats to the left of the president, not by accident. The White House had arranged seating strategically, hoping for tension without full-blown confrontation. Someone had even briefed her beforehand, "Stay focused. Keep it professional. Avoid bait." She didn't need the reminder. The topic on the table was early education funding, specifically the proposed cuts to federal grants that helped under-resourced districts pay for pre-K teachers, school meals, and transportation. Jasmine listened quietly for the first 20 minutes. She didn't speak until the president leaned into a comment about returning power to the states. That was her opening. With respect, she began, eyes locked on the table, this isn't about states managing their own education. It's about certain kids being priced out of a future before they even know how to write their name. A murmur moved down the table, mostly from her side. Landry rolled his eyes, then leaned back in his chair. Trump didn't look at her at first. He was flipping a page in his briefing binder as if he hadn't heard. Jasmine waited. I've visited 24 public schools in my district over the past year, she added. Some of them can't afford working heaters. You're asking teachers to do miracles without chalk or time. That got his attention. Trump looked up. He paused, narrowed his eyes. You don't belong in this room, he said slowly, without blinking. No one expected it. Not there, not during a live broadcast, not to her. It wasn't just a line. It was a dismissal, one meant to silence, humiliate, erase. The air tightened. No one touched their folders. No one shifted in their seat. Representative Jen reached for her pen but never wrote. Landry smirked slightly, lips pursed in satisfaction. Jasmine caught it, and she remembered. Back in Dallas, she'd once been asked by a police officer if the car she was driving was hers. It was paid off in full. But the way he asked, the way he looked at her, same energy, same cold pause, same loaded tone. But here she was, years later, in one of the most powerful rooms in the country, being told again she didn't belong. And once again, she knew better. What no one could see was the way her hand tapped twice against her thigh, her small cue to herself, don't speak yet. Don't rush it. Because if you've ever had to fight to be heard, you learn the value of timing. She let the silence carry the weight it needed to. And then, as the cameras kept rolling, she answered, not with anger, but with the exact opposite, measured, calm, precise. I was elected by the people, she said, just like you. It wasn't a comeback. It was a fact, the kind that didn't need dressing up, the kind that stood on its own legs. And in that moment, every person in the room had to make a decision, listen or look away. But even before her response reached living rooms and phones across the country, the meeting was already shifting, and Jasmine could feel the ground start to move. The clip hit social media before the meeting even ended. Someone in the press pool had isolated the moment, cut it clean, and posted it with no caption, just the two faces, the stillness, and Jasmine's response. It spread fast, like fire on dry brush. Within minutes, it was on X, then TikTok, then YouTube Shorts. It jumped platforms like it had wings. And people weren't just watching, they were listening. Some watched it twice. Some watched it 10 times because it wasn't just what was said. It was what it meant. The video showed Trump's face, stone-set and unmoved. Then Jasmine, sitting up just a little straighter, voice steady, words chosen like she had written them in her bones, I was elected by the people, just like you. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't performative. It was surgical. Comment sections filled up fast. Teachers wrote things like, this is what leadership looks like. A grandmother in Nebraska reposted the clip with the words, she spoke for all of us today. But there were others, too. Disrespectful, one man wrote under the video. He's the president. She needs to remember that. She didn't yell. She didn't curse. Why does her calm truth bother you? Someone replied. By nightfall, hashtags were trending, hashtag Crockett 2028, hashtag she belongs, hashtag had to listen to Jasmine. Cable networks played it on repeat. Panelists debated tone, intent, protocol. Some of them tried to reframe the moment, saying Trump misspoke or meant it differently. But the footage was too clean, the words too direct. There was no editing it away. Back in her hotel room near DuPont Circle, Jasmine sat on the edge of the bed, shoes still on, blazer unbuttoned. Her phone buzzed so much she turned it face down. Messages poured in, friends, colleagues, strangers. One text stood out. It came from someone she hadn't heard from in years, her old high school debate coach, Mr. Henry. It was short, still proud, still watching. She smiled, but only for a second, because in her gut, she knew this wasn't over. She opened Twitter, scanned the trending feed, then closed it. She'd already said what she needed to say. The rest wasn't hers to control. Outside her hotel window, DC traffic rolled past in the glow of headlights and crosswalk signals. Inside, her body finally started to come down from the hours of tension she'd been holding. But back inside the White House, aides scrambled. The communications director was rewriting a press statement before it hit morning outlets. A senior advisor was trying to convince the press team to frame the event as productive despite a moment of miscommunication. But everyone in the building knew that moment was the headline. Elsewhere in America, the response took different shapes. In a fourth-grade classroom in Lansing, Michigan, a teacher paused the live stream recording and turned to his students. "What did you notice about how she responded?" A kid in the back raised her hand. She didn't yell, but she still made him quiet. The teacher smiled. "That's called strength." In Philadelphia, a high school civics class rewrote the exchange as part of a mock debate. One group played the administration. The other chose to write as Jasmine. They didn't add anything, just repeated her words exactly. One student asked if they could put her quote on the classroom wall. Meanwhile, in Los Angeles, a late-night host closed his monologue with a joke. Trump told her she didn't belong in the room, and she reminded him that votes actually mean something. Weird flex, right? The audience laughed, but underneath the punchline, something deeper was shifting. By midnight, campaign emails from both parties referenced the moment, either to celebrate it or to spin it. And in living rooms, barbershops, grocery store lines, and break rooms, people kept asking the same question: why would he say that? The answer wasn't hard to figure out. But for many, the better question was, why did her answer feel like something we'd been waiting to hear for a long time? But just as the clip began to define the public narrative, Jasmine's next move would decide if this moment stayed a headline or became a turning point. Jasmine knew what she'd said. But she didn't fully realize how far it had gone until she walked into the green room at Good Morning America the next morning and saw the producer pull her aside with a stunned look. "You broke us," the woman whispered, holding up her phone where Jasmine's face was frozen mid-sentence on a paused video. "We've never had this many segment requests for a sitting congresswoman in under 24 hours. I mean, people are calling us asking for you." Jasmine didn't react. She was already thinking about what to say and what not to say when the cameras came on. She'd never wanted to be famous. Influence, yes, but fame, that was noise. The makeup artist powdered her cheekbones, then stepped back to let the stylist adjust her collar. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from her staffer back in Dallas: "Don't worry about the trolls. You're on fire." Still, she could feel her stomach pulling tight. The host entered the room, shook her hand, and said what so many others had: "I just have to say, that moment, unbelievable." Jasmine nodded politely, but her mind kept looping back to the table, to the look on Trump's face, to the way the room had fallen completely quiet. It hadn't been rehearsed. It hadn't been calculated. It had just been real. On set, the lights were hot, and the studio had that faint smell of coffee and floor wax. The moment the red light blinked on, she straightened her spine, crossed her ankles, and rested her hands in her lap. The host leaned in, tone soft but curious. "Congresswoman Crockett, when the president said you didn't belong in that room, what went through your mind?" She didn't hesitate. "I've heard that message in different forms since I was a kid. Sometimes it's said out loud. Sometimes it's in the silence. Either way, I don't accept it. The host nodded, but Jasmine wasn't finished. I belong in every room where decisions are made about my community. I belong in rooms where budgets are cut, where futures are decided. I belong there because I was sent there. And when he said I didn't, I knew he wasn't just talking to me. He was talking to every girl who ever got told to be quiet when she had something to say. The studio crew froze for a second, as if they knew they'd just captured a moment worth repeating. Backstage, the producer mouthed, "Wow." The interview went viral on its own. Within hours, the clip had more views than her original response from the White House. People weren't just reacting, they were quoting her, posting her words on signs, printing them on shirts, turning them into art. Someone graffitied, "I belong in this room," on a boarded-up building in Newark. In Kansas City, a group of teachers opened their morning meeting by watching her answer in full. One teacher, a man in his 60s, said, "I've never seen someone handle it like that. Never." In Tulsa, a mother named Rena, who had been homeschooling her 3 kids after their local school lost its federal funding, sent Jasmine an email. She wrote, "You reminded me that someone is still out there fighting. That maybe we're not invisible after all. I don't know what you're planning next, but we've got your back." Back in D.C., her office was overwhelmed: calls, donations, volunteer sign-ups. Even congressional colleagues who usually kept their distance suddenly wanted to be seen standing beside her. But Jasmine didn't let the attention soften her focus. At a press gaggle later that afternoon, when asked if she felt vindicated by the support, she simply said, "This was never about going viral. It was about making sure no one confuses silence for agreement. I said what I needed to say. Now I'm back to work." Still, behind her quiet discipline, she felt the ground shifting. She'd been underestimated before, but now they had to listen, not because of a viral moment, but because millions of people had leaned in and said, "That's the voice I trust." But as the momentum built and the cameras kept following her, Jasmine knew the story wasn't finished. It was just beginning to burn through the places it needed to reach. It didn't take long for the pushback to begin. By Friday morning, conservative commentators were already crafting their version of the story. A popular AM radio host in Tampa called her response disrespectful grandstanding. Another labeled her another loud freshman with no real policy chops. On cable news, the spin was relentless. One segment showed her response on a loop while 3 panelists argued whether she had undermined presidential decorum. Jasmine watched none of it. She was back in her district office in Dallas by then, sitting in a room with no cameras, a styrofoam cup of coffee going cold on her desk, and a stack of constituent letters that her aide had left for her to read. She picked one up at random. It was from an elementary school counselor in Amarillo. "Thank you," it read. "Thank you for not backing down. Thank you for being calm when the rest of us were screaming at our screens. That moment made my students believe they're allowed to speak up." Another was from a janitor in Tulsa. "I clean high schools every night and hear things no politician wants to think about. But you spoke like someone who actually knows." Jasmine sat quietly for a while, letting the weight of those words settle deeper than the noise from the talking heads. But outside her office, reporters were circling. Some were respectful. Some were looking for a sound bite they could twist. One reporter from a major paper shoved a mic toward her as she left a local parent meeting and asked, "Do you regret how it escalated?" Jasmine looked at her with the same cool she had shown in the Roosevelt Room. "I didn't escalate. I answered." That was all she said. Later that night, one of her aides brought over a list of the most aggressive online comments: death threats, ugly slurs, the kind of ugliness that always rises when a black woman holds her ground publicly. The aide hovered, unsure whether to show her. She didn't flinch. "Are they credible?" "No," the aide said. "Security's handling it. Nothing local." "Then I don't need to read them," Jasmine replied. "If they didn't scare me off at 21 when I took my first defense case, they're not going to scare me now." That's not to say it didn't wear on her. The hardest part wasn't the hate. It was the exhaustion. Every word she spoke was dissected, filtered through headlines, clipped into out-of-context quotes. Every interview required perfect posture. Every answer needed balance. But then came the letters, again and again, from parents, from veterans, from middle schoolers who had never watched C-SPAN in their lives. One came from a retired Republican educator in rural Idaho. "I don't agree with all your policies," he wrote, "but I agree with how you carry yourself. You reminded me what public service can look like." That one, she kept folded neatly and tucked into her notebook. Her mother called that weekend. Jasmine picked up on the third ring. "I watched it again this morning," her mother said. "I still don't know how you kept your face straight." Jasmine laughed quietly. "Neither do I. You made us proud, baby." She hadn't cried all week. But after she hung up, she sat down in the dark of her living room and let the tears come, quiet, heavy ones, not out of sadness, but from the pressure of holding so much steady for so long. She didn't let herself sit in it for more than 5 minutes. By Monday, she was back at work. Because the real fight wasn't on TV. It was in the school budgets she was trying to fix. It was in the legislation sitting in committee that could change how kids ate, learned, and grew up. The media would move on, but she wouldn't. She met with a group of Texas superintendents that week. The meeting was supposed to last 30 minutes. It ran for nearly 2 hours. At the end, one superintendent from El Paso shook her hand and said, "I don't care what side they say you're on. I care that you show up, and you do." But even as some tried to erase or downplay her words, Jasmine's focus never shifted. Because she knew what mattered most wasn't who agreed with her, but who needed her to keep going. The following week, Jasmine's schedule was packed: town halls, budget briefings, committee updates. But there was one visit she insisted on making herself, without cameras or press releases. Thomas Jefferson Middle School in Oak Cliff was a plain brick building that sat between an old grocery store and a tire shop. The paint on its front doors chipped from years of Texas sun. This wasn't a photo op. She didn't tell the school ahead of time. She just showed up. Principal Reyes met her at the door, slightly flustered but smiling. "You're causing a bit of a stir," she joked, leading Jasmine through the halls. Students peeked out of classroom windows, whispering to each other, eyes wide. A few waved. Jasmine waved back softly, like she always did. They ended up in a social studies class where students were watching a replay of the White House Education Summit. The teacher paused the video just before Jasmine's response. "Would you like to finish it live?" the teacher asked. Jasmine didn't hesitate. "Let's finish it together." She looked at the class, 7th graders mostly, a mix of kids from different backgrounds. Some leaned forward, others slouched in the back like they didn't want to seem too interested. But she could feel the curiosity, the quiet kind. "You see this room?" she asked, looking around. "Every decision that affects this school is made in another room, one with polished tables, big folders, people in suits who may never walk into a school like this." The students stayed silent, listening. "I don't look like most of the people in that room. And I didn't grow up thinking I'd ever sit at that table. But when I did, when I got there, they told me I didn't belong." She paused just long enough. "I didn't shout. I didn't storm out. I stayed because my job isn't to make people comfortable. It's to represent the ones who never get an invitation." A boy in the back raised his hand. "Were you scared?" Jasmine smiled. "I wasn't scared of him. I was scared of wasting the moment." That answer stuck. The teacher later told her 2 students quoted it in their journal entries the next day. After the visit, Jasmine sat in her car for a moment before driving off. She looked down at the notes she'd taken, small things she'd heard in the halls, a student asking if lunch would change again next week, another worried they wouldn't get a new science book next semester. These weren't national headlines, but they were real. Back at her district office, she met with a parent group from West Dallas. One woman, Lorraine Epps, had driven 2 hours to speak with her. "My son has been in 3 schools in 4 years, Lorraine said, voice shaking. "They keep closing things, shifting teachers, making promises they don't keep. I'm tired. He's tired, and it feels like no one in D.C. is even listening." Jasmine didn't interrupt. She let her finish. Then she said quietly, "I am." That was the truth of it. She hadn't gotten into politics to win fights on cable news. She was here because of people like Lorraine, because of the kids at Jefferson, because of her brother who never got a second chance, because no one should have to earn dignity. Later that night, she found herself staring at an email from a student named Dasha in Fort Worth. It read, "Hi, Congresswoman. I don't know if you'll read this, but I wanted to say thank you. I used to think nobody in D.C. cared about kids like me. My mom made me watch the summit. And when you said what you said, she cried. I didn't get it at first, but now I do. You reminded her she matters." Jasmine read it 3 times. Then she printed it, folded it, and kept it in the same notebook with the letter from the retired teacher in Idaho. Those letters were reminders, not of the moment that made her famous, but of who she was fighting for long before anyone knew her name. But as more people began to see her not just as a politician, but as a reflection of their own story, Jasmine felt the pressure shift and her responsibility deepen. By the time Jasmine walked onto the set of Meet the Nation, the buzz from the White House exchange had started to settle, but the spotlight hadn't dimmed, not even slightly. The producers had flown her in for a one-on-one Sunday segment, hoping to catch her off guard or spark a fresh headline. She knew the game. The set was colder than it looked on TV. Lights above her made her squint, but she didn't ask them to turn anything down. She sat where they told her, smoothed her skirt, unclasped her hands, then took a slow breath as the floor manager counted them down, 5, 4, 3, 2. The host, veteran journalist Jack Brenton, leaned toward her with that trademark half-smile, polished, polite, but ready to press. "Congresswoman Crockett, thank you for joining us. A lot has happened since your now famous moment with President Trump. Tell me, do you regret anything about how you handled it?" She didn't blink. "No." A pause. Then Brenton tried again. Even the tone, the setting. "Some have said it was disrespectful to confront a sitting president during a bipartisan policy meeting." "I didn't confront anyone," she replied. "I answered a dismissal with the truth. If we're going to have bipartisan meetings, then everyone in the room deserves to be treated like they belong in it." Brenton raised an eyebrow but didn't interrupt. Jasmine continued, her voice steady. "I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult him. I stated a fact, that I was elected by people who expected me to show up with a spine, and I did." The control room producers later told Brenton that their viewership spiked mid-sentence. Backstage, Jasmine's phone blew up again. This time, not with outrage, but admiration. People were texting clips of her appearance before the segment had even ended. But it wasn't just national media watching. At a diner in Grand Junction, Colorado, a waitress turned the volume up on the TV above the counter. "Y'all hear that?" she said to the booth behind her. She didn't even flinch. She just said what needed saying. At a union hall in Birmingham, several retired educators clapped as Jasmine pushed back against Brenton's follow-up question, "What's the bigger priority, tone or truth?" "Always truth," she'd said. "Tone gets you applause. Truth gets you policy." After the show, while waiting in a holding room for her driver, Jasmine had a quiet moment with one of the floor assistants. Young, maybe in his early 20s, nervous, he approached with hesitation, holding a rolled-up notepad. "Sorry, I'm studying journalism. I watched the meeting. I wanted to say what you did. It mattered." Jasmine smiled. "Then go report the truth someday. That's how you make it matter longer." He grinned and hurried away, and Jasmine sat back, just for a second, to breathe. But her day wasn't over. She had another interview lined up for the evening, this time on The Forum, a podcast known for long, unscripted conversations. No time limits, no commercial breaks. Host Aisha Colton welcomed her with a hug. "You ready to talk for real?" she asked. Jasmine laughed. "Always." The conversation ranged from policy to pressure, from representation to the emotional weight of constantly being expected to perform without fault. Aisha didn't hold back. "Do you ever get tired of being everyone's symbol?" she asked. The strong black woman, the poised one, the fighter, the one who always answers just right. Jasmine paused before answering. "I get tired of having to be perfect just to be accepted," she said. "But I don't get tired of representing people who've never seen themselves in these spaces. That's not a burden. That's fuel." It was her most candid moment yet. And that vulnerability did something the political moment hadn't. It made her real, not a clip, not a meme, a human being. The episode became the most downloaded in the podcast's history within 2 days. But Jasmine didn't celebrate. She was already back in D.C., preparing for a closed-door education committee session. No cameras, no sound bites, just policy. That's where she believed change actually happened. But while the press leaned in for spectacle, Jasmine knew her real power wasn't in what they aired. It was in what she did after the cameras cut. 10 days after the now infamous exchange, Jasmine walked back through the West Wing entrance of the White House. This time, the air felt heavier, not with tension, but with eyes. Staffers didn't look past her anymore. They looked at her. Some nodded quietly. A few looked down, trying to stay neutral. But the shift was real. Respect doesn't always come with applause. Sometimes it shows up as silence when no one interrupts you. She had been invited to a follow-up session on early learning legislation, this time a much smaller private strategy meeting with 4 key legislators and the president's senior education advisor. Not many words had been shared in advance. The invite simply read, "Continuing the conversation." In the hallway outside the Roosevelt Room, she caught her reflection in the glass of a framed photo. Hair tied back, no makeup beyond lip balm, dark navy blazer that fit just right. She didn't dress for the room. She dressed for the work. Inside, the chairs had been rearranged, no nameplates, no formality, just a circle of people and a notepad on the table. "Congresswoman," said Deputy Secretary Ellis as she stood to greet her. "Thanks for coming." Jasmine gave a firm nod, then sat down. Representative Dalia Jen was already there, giving her a small smile. Senator Kelman arrived next, less smug this time, maybe even contemplative. Then the door opened. A senior White House policy aide stepped in, briefcase in hand. "No cameras today," he said plainly. "Just discussion. The president won't be joining, but he'll be briefed." No one commented. Jasmine didn't flinch. They got to work. The conversation was less combative than before, but not warm. They debated funding models, teacher retention, the politics of testing mandates. It wasn't easy, but Jasmine didn't come for easy. She came with numbers, real ones, about how many schools in her district relied on Title I grants just to keep doors open, about kids who were already behind by the time they reached 2nd grade. Midway through, Kelman spoke up. "I'll be honest," he said. "I don't always agree with your methods, but your data is hard to argue with." Jasmine didn't let it soften her tone. "It's not about methods. It's about whether we're okay letting zip codes decide opportunity." Jen nodded. "We're supposed to be fixing the pipeline, not watching it crack." Ellis scribbled something down, then looked up. "You think the president is open to a revised funding formula?" Jasmine didn't answer right away. She looked at each face around the table, then said plainly, "If he isn't, then let's not call this a bipartisan effort. Let's call it what it is." The room went quiet, not offended, just quiet. Because when someone speaks without posturing, it's harder to dodge the truth. They spent another hour refining language for a draft proposal. Jasmine pushed hard for language that would prioritize underfunded districts, not just by poverty rate, but by historical neglect. She didn't want band-aids. She wanted repair. As the meeting ended, no one clapped. No one made speeches. They simply gathered their notes, shook hands, and walked out with fewer illusions than before. Outside, as Jasmine waited for her car, a familiar face approached, one of the White House communications staffers who had been present during the original summit. "Just wanted to say the room's different now," she said quietly. Jasmine looked at her. Good. It needed to be. That night, she declined interviews. Instead, she met with a group of school counselors at a D.C. library. They sat in a circle with no table between them, sharing what they saw in classrooms that rarely made it into policy reports. Kids with anxiety disorders by age 9, language barriers that went ignored, parents who worked 3 jobs just to afford basic supplies. Jasmine didn't speak much. She listened, took notes, stayed late. She knew the cameras wouldn't cover that meeting. There'd be no viral clip, no trending moment. But it mattered because, for all the noise and all the headlines, the work had always been about this: getting in the room, staying in it, and shifting what happens after the applause. But with each door that opened, Jasmine knew more would try to close, so she stayed ready for every room that came next. The weeks passed, but the moment didn't fade, not like most viral things do. Jasmine's words kept resurfacing on signs, at protests, in speeches at school board meetings, even in sermon quotes from pulpits in places she'd never been. A community center in Tucson painted a mural with her now famous quote, "I belong here because my district sent me here." A group of high schoolers in Jackson started a podcast called The Room, dedicated to interviewing people who'd been told they didn't belong and stayed anyway. But Jasmine wasn't thinking about legacy. Not yet. She was thinking about legislation. By late spring, the revised education funding bill was gaining traction, slowly, carefully, but it was moving. It included new language on equity audits, baseline infrastructure standards for public schools, and dedicated mental health support for districts under Title I, small wins on paper, but big in practice. She didn't claim them as hers. She wasn't that kind of politician. In every interview, she redirected credit back to her constituents. "I don't make change by myself," she said during a radio call-in. "I carry the stories of the people who sent me here. I just refuse to drop them." Still, the pressure mounted. Every time she spoke, people listened more closely now, waiting for the next big moment, but she resisted the urge to perform. At one event in Phoenix, a reporter tried to bait her with a leading question: "What do you say to those who think you're just capitalizing on controversy?" She didn't blink. "I say that if telling the truth is controversial, then our standards are broken." That was the thing about Jasmine. She didn't rise to the bait. She didn't throw red meat. She just stayed grounded, even when the spotlight kept trying to spin her into something louder, flashier, more polished. She refused. She had work to do. At a roundtable in St. Paul, a single father named Kian shared his story about how his son's school had been without a math teacher for 4 months. Jasmine listened, asked questions, and promised to follow up. 2 weeks later, her office called that school. Quietly, no press involved. They found a way to expedite a substitute certification for a local tutor who had been volunteering. That school finally got a math teacher. Kian never knew it was Jasmine's team that pulled the strings. He just said, "Thank you," and kept going. That's how she liked it, because it was never about clapping back. It was about staying in the room long enough to fix what needed fixing. In one of her last interviews before Congress went into recess, a host asked her, "Do you think what happened in that room with the president changed anything permanently?" Jasmine paused, then said, "It didn't change everything, but it made people look twice. It reminded folks that belonging isn't granted. It's earned at the ballot box, and it's protected by showing up again and again, even when you're told you don't fit. The host leaned forward. And what are you doing next? She smiled just a little. I've still got work to do. And I've still got kids back home waiting on books, buses, and teachers who don't quit mid-year. I'll rest when they stop needing me. There was no applause, no dramatic music cue, just quiet understanding. Because when someone speaks from a place that's deeper than politics, you don't have to agree with them to respect them. Jasmine Crockett walked into a room where she was told she didn't belong. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't slam her fists. She stayed. She spoke. And then she got to work. And in doing so, she reminded the country of something it often forgets: sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is refuse to leave the room. If you've ever been told you're too loud, too soft, too different, or too real for the spaces you're in, remember this: the room doesn't make your voice valid. You do. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. And if you believe stories like this matter, subscribe for more. The work continues.